a piece Mike wrote. But Mike, if you don't know him, you should, for a bunch of reasons. One, longtime political director at the AFL-CIO, longtime really smart guy in the Democratic Party, and for our current purposes, author of Weekend Reading, which is the name of his Substack that you absolutely should follow if you don't already. So, Mike, you wrote this piece, and I don't know where I was because I was kind of like trapped in snow cancellation flight hell. I think I was somewhere in Florida, and someone sent it to me, and I just thought it was terrific.
Thank you.
And so I wanted to, number one, I wanted to shine a light on the piece. It's called "How Trump," in quotes, "won." It is in Mike's Weekend Reading Substack. I want to start. It's a long piece, and there's a lot to get to, including a baseball analogy that I love. But I wanted to start with this line because so much, I think, of where do Democrats, and for that matter, Republicans, go from here is dependent on what actually happened, right? Our understanding of what happened. People always say, why are you looking back? The election's over. It's like, well, that's a critical piece. Understanding that helps us understand where to go. So this line from you, I thought I want you just to talk to first. You
Sure.
said the results of the 2024 election are best understood as a vote of no confidence in Democrats, not an embrace of Trump or MAGA. Tell me, sort of give me the broad, like, how you arrived at that and what it sort of means as we go forward.
Sure. No, and I think it actually is very important to understand what happened, since after all, the reason for having elections is for people to be clear about their expectations of people who govern them.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not necessarily necessary to have it from I'm a partisan and I want to learn this stuff, but all of us as citizens should care that the people that get elected understand what we want. And that's really an important part of this, right?
Yep.
And so the point that you're raising is that almost after every single election, we just assume that the person who got the most votes is a champion. Like people, like they're
People
brilliant.
love them.
Right.
Yeah.
Like this is, it's always about um, their special sauce. They're tapping into the heart of America, right?
Yes.
And although I didn't use this in there, it occurs to me that it's like there's this joke about you have campers and a bear attacks the campsite and the people run away, and at that point you actually don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun everybody else.
So I used to. Oh, it's so funny you mentioned that. So when I window into my world, I do give some paid speeches now to various organizations. And when it was Trump versus Biden, I would always say to people, like, look, I can tell you a lot of ways to think about the election, but I use that exact analogy,
Yeah,
which is like, neither one of you don't have to the bear being the electorate. You don't have
yeah,
to escape the bear. You just have to escape the other guy. Anyway, it's just funny
right,
because I used
right,
to talk about that all the time.
but running faster than the other guy doesn't mean that you're ready for the Olympics, right?
You're not
So
Usain Bolt.
right, exactly, right. But I think the other part of the analogy that is important is that the electorate is pretty angry and pretty unsatisfied with the options it keeps getting served, especially for the last 10 elections. Right? In the last 10 elections, 9 times they fired the power party in power.
That's
Right.
amazing. I saw that stat in the piece, and it's just
Right. And so it's like, how many times can we tell you we don't like these choices? And so to like ignore that, to ignore the fact that as I got into in pretty great detail, this wasn't about lots more people deciding they wanted Trump to be president. It was about a lot of people deciding they didn't want to go out and vote for Kamala Harris for the Democrats.
so. I want you to explain. I love and by the way, for people just joining, number one, thank you. Number two, I see my former Georgetown fellow Georgetown Hoya alum, Dan Pfeiffer. Hello, Dan. Hope you're doing well. If you don't read Dan's Substack message box, you should. Um, Mike, I want to ask you about you. The one of the conceits you have in the piece is you compare flatland to 3D land as it relates to a lot of things, baseball and other things. But explain sort of what you mean and why that's important in understanding what actually happened in November.
Sure. And it really, one of the most consequential flaws in the way elections get reported on is that it's always the percentage each candidate got of usually the votes cast for either of the two major party candidates, right? Which means that that erases any ability to understand whether it was the winner finding a new constituency and doing better, or whether it's the loser losing support, right? Or some mixture of that. And that is a problem of the whole field, right? Is that when you eliminate that piece of information, you make yourself less able to understand what happened, right? And so
Right.
if you
It's not a zero sum game. It's not that every voter who voted in one election votes in the next election and you say, well, up two for Trump means down
right,
two for Harris.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, right. And the analogy that I used in the piece was Red Sox Yankees, right? If you had a survey of like who had the most fans, right? And I don't know the age group here we're talking to, um, but if you're a Red Sox fan, right, in 19 after 1985, they go to the World. They're going to the World Series in 1986. You're probably going to say, yeah, they're my favorite team. Then, they get to the sixth game of the World Series against the Mets. Bill Buckner famously lets the ball roll between his legs.
Yep.
Next survey, you're probably not going to say the Red Sox are your favorite team. But if you're from Boston, there's no way in hell that means you become a Yankee fan.
Right.
But in
Right.
Flatland, where you only get to vote for the Red Sox or Yankees as your favorite team, the Yankees are going to have a better percentage of the two-party fan vote because I didn't vote,
Yep.
right? But to then just reflexively decide the Yankees have tapped into something primal about the American baseball spirit is what we keep doing every 4 years, right? And we have this ability to just forget that we keep doing it every 4 years, and that it never, especially in the 21st century, ever pans out, right? Because within months after taking office, in the really putting aside 9/11, three-quarters of the time presidents are in office, they're underwater approval,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Right? Like people just like don't like either of them.
So there were a couple of things that really jumped out to me. And by the way, folks, I cannot commend Mike's piece, How Trump Won Higher. Lots of you have already read it, by the way, because it's gotten a pretty big reception that it deserves. It's in Mike's Substack Weekend Reading. One thing that I thought that I was struck by, you write this, so I'm reading off my computer. You write, while Trump won 3 million more votes this year than in 2020, he won the same share of the eligible population as he did 4 years ago, 32%. Meanwhile, Harris's share of eligible voters fell to 31.1%, a 3.5 point drop from Biden, which
Right.
is fascinating, I think, because look, Donald Trump says and does lots of things, but one of the things that he has, a simple analysis would be, well, there were 7 swing states. He won all 7 of them. And he got over 300 electoral votes. So it was a whitewash. It was a clear. This was a clear vote for Donald Trump, right? Like he told people what he was going to do, and they turned out in huge numbers to vote for him. But what I just read suggests
Yeah.
they turned out about the same numbers to vote
Right.
for. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Right. And that's sort of the point, right? Is that he has a very loyal following, right? That came out again. and because every cycle more people age in, of course it's going to get more votes from people, the I don't know, it's off the top of my head, like 55% of people hadn't voted before, plus or minus, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
where it's getting those votes from, and that's not surprising. But that sort of treads water in terms of the number of people who are eligible.
So one point you made that I really like is, and you've talked about change, and you cited a chart I cite all the time, this 538 chart about incumbent governments worldwide. That virtually there were 74 elections globally, I think, in 2024, plus or minus. I may be off by a few, but in virtually every one, the incumbent or ruling party either lost ground in their parliament or their legislature, or that incumbent lost. Is that's a function of what you're talking about, right?
Right.
That this election fits into a broader global trend more than it is sui generis just about Trump.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And it's of a piece, not just of this worldwide trend where it's governed, affected by the things that are common, like high inflation and the aftershocks of getting back from the pandemic, and those things that are common. But it also is about the things that are uniquely American, and that because as I was saying before, the 9 out of 10 firings, elections, also that this is only the second time, the last time in the 19th century that you have had three consecutive flips of the White House, right? So there, even without all of that, the worldwide context, right? There's a real disconnect between what both parties are offering the public and what they want.
So that to me, I look, we could spend the entire time talking about Trump, but I don't want to do that because one of the things, number one, because I spend a lot of time talking about Trump anyway, but uh, one of the things I really liked about your piece is doesn't like so much analysis to me, and I use analysis advisedly here, is well, Trump is a racist misogynist, and everyone who voted for him is a racist misogynist. And I'm like, okay, well, even if I grant that, that doesn't help me understand like what is the Democratic Party? They lost to that guy. So, like, where does the Democratic Party go? And one of the things I really liked is, and I read this quote again, which is right at the top of your piece, and I want to focus on, we focused a little bit on the second part. I want to focus on the first part. You wrote, the results are best understood as a vote of no confidence in Democrats, not an embrace of Trump or MAGA. I want to focus on that, a vote of no confidence in Democrats. Um, Tell me what does that look like in the numbers as you went through in this piece? How do you draw that conclusion out?
Sure. So there are a couple ways to think about it, all that all sort of get you the same conclusion. One, if you want to be kind of voter file and math or stat oriented around it, is that start with 2016. Um, we began like an election where most people didn't like either candidate. The vote for both of them as turnout was relatively low. We all understood that they didn't want what it was. People just didn't like them, right?
They didn't like what was being sold.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you get Trump, and suddenly politics becomes a 360 surround sound,
Mm-hmm.
and you get a really big reaction against the things that he's doing, and especially after COVID, this sense of alarm and urgency over the summer of 2020 and going into the fall, just really across sort of the media, civil society, all elements, that the dangers of a second Trump term were too much.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had a sudden huge increase in the number of people who voted for Biden over Clinton, right? Both Biden and Trump's vote went up,
Yep.
But the big difference was that Biden went up by more,
Yep.
right? And what was really important, and again, we're to your original point about the importance of understanding why, right? Whether you look at Pew or Catalyst, or basically the exit polls, they all agree on one thing, which is that the people who voted in 2016 and 2020 were about 2 points Democratic. They voted
Hmm.
for Clinton by about 2 points. They voted for Biden about 2 points. The reason Biden got from 2 points to 4.5 was the balance of all those new voters,
Yep.
right? And that was what was going on. What's happening now, and that's why I'm expressing it as no confidence, is that whatever it was that got these folks who really didn't care about politics in 2016, but felt that Trump was enough of a threat that they should call on the Democrats as a counter, 19 million of them stayed home, right? And that's what I mean. It was, and I use the term no confidence because, and it wasn't a rejection or a change in their values, right? It was of the voters. It was just going, back and being more alienated from the political process, right? And not thinking, right? They had voted for Biden. He said he was going to, fight for the soul of the nation. Well, like this isn't working, and so they stayed home. But it's really important to be able to understand the difference between staying home because you don't have confidence in Democrats and suddenly thinking, 4 years ago I thought I should have a right to an abortion, but now I've changed my mind and I'm now like all down with Project 2025, right?
So a couple things off of that. One, are we, and God knows the political media does this, are we, I'm not including you, but I'm going to include myself in the political media, are the tendency, we talked about this right at the start, but for people who weren't there, I'm going to restate it. We talked about how, and this is true of every election I've ever covered, if you win, you and everyone who advised you is an absolute genius who has fundamentally reshaped the American electorate. And if you lose, you are an idiot who should never be heard from again, and you misjudge the mood of the country, and my God, how terrible you are. And of course, like breaking news, those black and white dichotomies are rarely accurate. But I do feel in some ways like after this election, it was like, well, people want Trump's populism. They want aggressive foreign policy. They don't care about his criminal conduct. They and they don't care about his unpredictability. They voted for him. This is a referendum on him. He did well. He is more in line with what people want. Whereas Kamala Harris is a communist lefty, and people rejected her and rejected wokeism. It seems to me as I read this piece, you don't say it outright, but it seems to me that your belief is like we're reading way too much into maybe not enough in some parts, the math part, and way too much in the what it all means part.
Right.
Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And even just extending on what I was saying about no confidence is that we the 70% of the drop off that Harris suffered happened in the bluest places in the country,
Mm-hmm. Right.
right? And
This is why New Jersey and Illinois and
right,
we're close.
and
California.
right, not just those states, but LA, and right, and if you like can look at the data from something other than that very top line number, right? There's no other corroborating evidence that the people of Los Angeles want all the things you just said
Right.
are
They're
now
not big Project 2025
right,
advocates, to
and
your
that
point.
they're not for the things you just described. Yet, literally, the people who stayed home there are driving your conclusion, right? In terms of the level of victory, right? I put aside in the piece talking about what happened in the 7 battleground states
Yeah.
because it's complicated and I don't like just speculating. In a few months, we'll have all the voter files. It'll be much easier to say something more intelligent about that. But in terms of something really important that contributes to this, well, he won the popular vote, so it must mean everybody is on board for it, right? The in just the 20, and I want people to understand, I'm not trying to like do a reverse denier thing. This all happened, right? This is not like the people who said, oh, there's something suspicious, right? There isn't. But from the point of view of trying to understand what happened, when you realize that if yeah, you'd had reasonable turnout in just the 20 counties, the most blue counties in the country, he loses the popular vote, right? It's that close, and it's so much in coming from those places that are so blue, right? And the other contradiction that you get there is that Democrats netted 6 House seats in the places that Trump made his quote biggest gains, right? But they're gains in flatland, right? In
Right.
3D land, you get 6 more House seats, which is why the House is as close as it is. You get like the closest Senate race there is Hogan at 12 points,
Yep.
right? There isn't corroborating evidence that that blue state voters have gone red.
And so I guess I have a couple thoughts. So one is, well, let me ask the basic one, and you cover some of this in your piece. And by the way, I'm going to keep recommending the piece. It's How Trump Won. It's on Weekend Reading, which is Mike's Substack that if you are not a subscriber to, you should be. First of all, let's just in terms of 2024. You said 19 million fewer people voted for Harris. Why? Right?
I didn't say 19 million people fewer voted for Harris. I said that 19 million people who had voted for Biden stayed home.
Right. Sorry. Yes. 19
Yeah.
million people who voted for Biden stayed home. Is there a why in the numbers that you see?
Yeah, I think I think that the fact that the drop in turnout was greatest in places where people could reasonably think they had less to fear from a second Trump term has something to do with it, right? I think if you're living in California, you're certainly less attuned to the threat on abortion or on any number of other things than you are, and that's why the the turnout in the 7 battleground states was pretty much the same as it was 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Just radically different from the other 43 states in terms of people showing up.
So just the you made this point earlier, but sort of one of the reasons that the electorate grew in Biden's direction was this idea, the kind of, okay, we've now seen what Trump can and will do.
Right.
We're in the middle of a pandemic, that at least at the time, the majority of people thought he was not handling well. And so it was a clear and present danger to a lot of people in 2020.
Right.
Fast forward 4 years, it feels like a less clear and present danger to them. Is that your sort of
Yeah, absolutely.
hypothesis?
I
Okay.
mean, then to be clear, that's not just, oh, Mike thinks that they didn't like, yeah, but I mean, that's sort of what passes for analysis, right? It's like you just sort of say, well, this was. I think there are lots of ways to see it. I think that the, on the surveys that would ask questions like, how likely is it, do you think that Trump will implement X, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the real difference between people who in those surveys were saying they were definitely voting for Harris and maybe was really around that, right? And I think that it makes sense. I think that, and this is a little bit maybe harsh for some people who are Democrats to process, right? But Biden came in, right, saying that Trump was an existential threat.
Yep.
Everyone was talking, but it was episodically, right? And at the end of the day, like nothing was done, right? And there's a way in a sort of well, I'm going to think it through the way I'm about to say it kind of thing. But when people keep telling you that this is existential, 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 and you're not doing anything about it,
Yep.
right? If you cry fire in a theater, but you stay there eating your popcorn,
Yep.
right? Then
How
other people,
existential can it be?
right? How agitated are people going to be? How much are they going to believe that it's really that much of a threat, right? And I think that's part of it. I think another, but even though this is sort of where the conversation's going, I never want to leave off that in any other country, if you had this fact pattern where a president loses an election, tries an insurrection, and then is given immunity by a court where three of the people he appointed, right? If we looked at this in Hungary, right, you and I wouldn't be talking about the exit polls in Bucharest to understand what is going on in Hungary,
Right.
right? Right? I mean, like the reason he is going to be in the White House is because the justices that he appointed him let him off the hook, right? Not just in the immunity case, but in the Colorado case earlier in the year, where even Amy Coney Barrett didn't go along with it, where they said not only should he be on the ballot, but we're going to disable the insurrection clause of the 14th Amendment. And then on top of that, take until July, at which point, even on the minuscule things they were saying he could be tried on, there was no time to do it. And then you have canon and all of those things. So that's not the Democratic Party's fault. But when you have like all these different signals, right? Um, where you would think, well, the legal system should take care of them. Well, they're not. And so how serious could it be?
Yep. Totally. Is there I always again talk about like hindsight and backseat driving analysis. There's always people who are like, "See, I knew Harris shouldn't have talked about they them so much," and I always remind like she didn't. Like Trump ran an ad of her answering a question from 2019, I think, but
Right.
she didn't. Um, you know, I'm trying to sort of think. I know if you said to me, Chris, what was Biden's message? I think it was still existential threat to democracy. And candidly, this is to your point, but I talked to a lot of Democratic consultants while Biden was still in the race who were like, whether or not you think Trump is an existential threat to democracy, that message is not working among independents. So, I mean, the Harris message, I mean, maybe the problem is that I can't totally think of it, but was there as you look at the data, was there a winning message out there for her, or was this, and you get into some of this in the piece, was this kind of a perfect storm of outside variables that combined to see her drop off 19 million votes from what Biden got?
Right. So one thing that's important in the beginning of your question to engage, because I think the shorthand that gets used, existential threat to democracy, um, when stated as a message or as the way it's characterized, is absolutely a loser,
Okay.
right? The and But what ends up happening is that what's underneath that shorthand, which is the loss of particular freedoms, the
Right.
the things that
Like lived
actually,
reality.
right, the actual things that would happen, those were very potent, right? If you believe those things are going to happen, then you go out and vote, right? I think one of the um, one of the things that's really overlooked in term, I hate using the term messaging, but I think one of the things that's overlooked in political communication and how it like this all works is that there's nothing more powerful in terms of motivating human behavior than loss aversion, right?
Yep.
That, right. And so there, again, this is where flatland 3D land is important. In flatland, you think all you're trying to do is win a contest where someone has to vote for you or the other person, right? And there, like arguments matter and stuff like that, right? But there's a third choice, which is whether to vote or not.
Mm-hmm.
And what ends up getting people to the polls for him, for Harris, for anybody, among people who don't vote in every election because they just vote in every election is what do they think the stakes are?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the people around them concerned about? Are they going out and voting? Right. And for them, right, for the people, most of those 19 million people, the issue wasn't, well, I don't know what to do because I like Trump about this and I like Harris about that. Right. If, there were mandatory voting, they would have voted for Harris.
Yep.
Right. So, and that's what's sort of missing in terms of this sense of alarm, right? That if there's this ambient sense of alarm about what's going to happen, then people show up. And if there isn't, they don't, right? And so I don't think that this was really a messaging problem in the way you framed the question,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think it was a reality problem, right? That right the that that in this sort of this time, whereas every time there's the Gallup or Pew polls that says how many people are Democrats or Republicans or
Yep.
independents, fewer and fewer people are willing to say I'm a Democrat or Republican, right? Which means which is a function of more and more people just not believing what politicians say, right?
Yep.
And so if you are someone who's going to believe something that either Trump or Harris says, and you're already voting for them,
Yep.
right?
Totally.
Right. And so the question is, what was the media doing? What were your friends who follow politics a little more doing? And those are all very, interdependent and sort of reify with each other. And that's more of what was going on, I think. And I think to I think the place where, and here I don't want to be specific, it wouldn't be appropriate to be just specific to Harris, but I think to Democrats and to a lot of advice they were getting, in a way, is that, as we've been saying, people on both sides of the aisle are very unsatisfied with the way America's going, right? It's like
Yep.
3/4 of people think the country's on the wrong track, right? Which, by the way, is a tough election to win, right? If you're
Yes.
you're
the incumbent party.
right? And so it really says something about Trump's unpopularity that he doesn't get to 50% in a country where 3/4 of the people think you're going in the wrong direction.
Can I quickly sidebar there? My
Yeah, yeah,
argument has always been that Trump was among the weakest, if not the weakest person Republicans could nominate for president this time around. And everyone said, oh, well, he won and he won the popular vote. Is it your belief? And I know we can't, hypotheticals are hypotheticals.
right.
We're not going to rerun the election. But let's just say, I'm not going to pick Nikki Haley because I think I know the answer there. Let's say Ron DeSantis was the Republican nominee, right? And it's very standard issue, kind of like, he's credentialed. He's been the governor of Florida. He was a member of Congress. He's got a nice resume. He's awkward personally. But does Ron DeSantis win easier than Donald Trump in your mind?
So I'll give you a more fat data-based answer
Please.
by just placing it in time. Because I'm 100% in agreement that Trump is probably historically the best intra-party politician the country's ever had.
Yeah.
In terms of owning his party.
Yes.
and one of the worst in terms of being a general election candidate.
Totally. He never
And
makes any inroads. Yes, totally.
right,
Yes, go ahead.
right. And so in 2016, right, you had sort of this consensus that Clinton did not run a great campaign, right? And yet she did better, he did worse in the Senate races in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, like the places that like she was supposed to have really screwed up, right?
Yep.
And at that point, I was still at the AFL-CIO, and up until March, and when Trump got to the point of getting the nomination, right, our polling showed that Bush and Cruz and Rubio were running way ahead of her,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And which I think speaks to the point you're asking about, right? Is that that in it, I think in any other context, as we saw, like the way the conservatives got wiped out in England, the election would have looked more like that,
Okay.
right? Because
Yeah, right. If you just had a generic Republican as
right,
opposed to Trump, right?
yeah.
Yep. Can we spend? I don't want to take too much of your time, but let's spend 10 minutes at the end here on what do Democrats do now, or should they not do anything? So it's a cottage industry to write the op-ed in the New York Times. I have it pulled up. James Carville has written one. It was last week. He said basically, I'll sum it up for you guys. If you don't have a New York Times subscription, he basically said it's still the economy, stupid. We the Democrats are not connecting on sort of the economic day-to-day lived experience economic issues, and that needs to change. Both we need to change the message and the messenger. There are some people who say within the Democratic Party say, look, Biden and Harris, they tried to go too moderate. We need Bernie Sanders style populism. There are other people in the Democratic Party who say this election is proof that the left and wokeism, and the party is too enthralled with that. We need to go more to the middle. We need Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, who pick your person. Making the meta argument above that, Mike, I'm intrigued. It's like, do you think Democrats should do anything? Like, it's always, of course, you lose, you think we got to change. Do Democrats need to change or not?
Well, I think that in order to accomplish what, right? I mean,
Right.
I think that the obsession with national politics obscures a few really important things that really make this such a toxic environment, right? Which is that, as you know, almost every election and going way back now in an uncharacteristic way have been really close nationally,
Yep.
right? And yet every presidential election in the 21st century has been a landslide in both directions in red and blue states, right? In blue states and red states, the presidential candidates have been winning by 15 to 25 points each of these elections, right? This is what the country looked like before the New Deal, right? Where
Yep.
we could understand it, where the South voted for the Democrats, the North voted for the Republicans, rinse and repeat, right? And so what that means is that the elected Democrats are incredibly successful in every election other than the presidential, and vice versa, right? All the things that make you a successful Democratic or Republican elected official, right, is engineered for where you come from, right? And it's just this like weird national system that makes both parties ill suited to get the kind of majorities that everybody's talking about,
Right.
right? And it isn't as if, well, if we had said this instead of that, you're going to change like two very fit in parts of the country that have intensified very different kinds of values and what desires about how to organize their lives, and suddenly erase all that, right? It's just that's why this is such a why it's an increasingly dangerous situation the country's in, and why it keeps toggling back and forth.
So what do you do? I mean, one of the things I think of, it's like, we're so election driven, that I could totally see, so we've got this, um, and again, I'm talking, this is in flatland analysis, not
Yeah,
3D land analysis, but in flatland, it's Trumpism and the Republican Party ascendant, populism on the march. Can Democrats regain young men and non-white voters, et cetera, et cetera? And I could totally see in 2026, because of what we both know about midterms, when the
right.
president's part, I could totally see in 2026 Democrats picking up like 2 or 3 Senate seats, 15 House seats. And it's like, well, does that mean that there was nothing wrong then? 20 early 2025. That's what I always wonder about. It's like, Democrats could do nothing different between now and 2026, and history would suggest to us 2026 should be a good year for Democrats. So does
Right.
that mean they have a problem or they don't have a problem?
No, it means the country has a problem. Right. Right. That's the point,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Is that our problem as citizens, right, is that like we only get these two choices, right? And as long as the dynamics that serve up each of the choices, right, or outside don't put on the menu what we want to order, right? We just keep trying something new on the menu and then like
We
getting
don't like
upset.
it.
Yeah. And then like, okay, we'll try the next thing.
So, I mean, what I hear in this, and I would assume what a lot of people hear, and I'll end on this, but what I hear in this is, if I'm someone who's just tuning in this conversation, I'm thinking, well, why the hell isn't there another party that has a menu of things that people actually want? And yet, I am a cynical enough veteran. I guess that's what they do when you're old. They call you veteran political observer. Um, to know that, like, Ross Perot's 20 or 21% in '92 is the high water mark, right? Like, there's not a lot of evidence that a third party is somehow going to succeed. So, like, why why isn't that the case, given what you said? Like, we keep serving people from the same menu, and everything they order they don't like. Wouldn't the natural human instinct be to, let's go to a different restaurant, or at least ask if they have a different menu?
Well, I think there are a couple of big things that make that hard to realize, right? One is that um, Democrats and Republicans are like legislated onto the ballot line all the time,
Yep.
right? And it is, all but a formal legal duopoly, that both parties have like always shown to be like the thing you can count on them agreeing with each other about,
So
right?
true. The other
Right,
side is evil, except we can only have one other
right,
side. Yeah.
right. And like no one really wants to open, neither of them wants to open that door, right? And
By the
and
way,
then
to your point, I thought it was so funny when RFK Jr. was an independent, still trying to get into the
yeah,
debates. The only thing that the two parties agreed on, the Trump campaign and
right,
at the time the Biden campaign, is we absolutely cannot have RFK Jr. in the
right,
debate.
right, yeah. And and then there's just the enormous amount of resources that it takes, right? And so the the only, and this is true for Perot, is the only imaginable third party candidate at this point is a billionaire, right?
Yep.
It's not what people are looking for,
Right.
right?
Exactly. The person who could do it from a logistical and financial perspective is uniquely unsuited to the
Right,
moment that people the kind of person
Right.
someone who is dissatisfied with their two choices could choose.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's why my Dwayne The Rock Johnson candidacy just grows more and more intriguing. Okay, so let me end on this. When you did this deep dive, and if I said to you, okay, Mike, this is a lot of words. I'm not going to say how many, but a lot. I'm not going to count it in this piece. If I said to you, what's the biggest misconception that the average person, or even the average, because the average person is probably not thinking about the election, but the average person who follows politics, let's call it that, what's the biggest misconception people have about what happened on November 5th?
Yeah, what I think we've mostly been talking about, the
Yeah.
biggest misconception is that America has embraced MAGA fascism, right? I mean, because also to circle back, when you look at some of the other elected people of that mold, right? Like an Orban or
Mm-hmm.
a Duterte or Erdogan or going back to the 30s, right? When they won, they didn't just like win the election, they mostly won by a lot,
Yeah.
right? They, right, people had a better idea of what they were voting for in the context they were voting. They were for it at the time, at least at the beginning, right? But that's just not the case here. Again, this is just about outrunning the other
It's
guy, not the
so
bear,
true. It's so
right?
true.
Right?
I think that is so apt.
Right. But that's the misconception, right? It's just this reflexive acceptance that whatever the person who didn't lose says they're for is what America is suddenly for. And
And the
it
truth
would
is,
only take actually going out to America to see that it's ridiculous.
right, because the truth is, America isn't the thing I found the most compelling about your piece is the real story of the election, or one of the real stories. I
Yeah.
wouldn't say the real story, but one of the real stories of the election is not who voted, it's who didn't vote, right?
Right.
And why.
Right. And that's actually one of the things that I think is so problematic about sort of the like political commentary industrial complex and media and all of that is because the if you don't ask, you can't know,
Correct.
right? And so I don't know, I downloaded like the 538 database of all polls, and like there were easily 4 million, I think, interviews in all the different surveys that went into it, right? And all those surveys are just about what did voters think, right? There hasn't been any polling of any scale afterwards to investigate what the people who didn't vote were thinking,
Right. And
right?
you're not even talking about people who have never voted. You're saying like
Oh
people
yeah,
who voted in 2020.
right. Thank you, Rich. That's a really important thing because
Yeah.
often this gets dismissed as well. There's some people who just never vote, right? I'm not going there. I'm saying these are people who cared enough just 4 years ago to vote, right? They're not whatever conception you have of who a non-voter is, right? It's not great that we don't care about them. Here, we're just
Right.
talking.
Ideally,
Of,
everyone votes. We know that's not the case. But
right,
your point is, you're not saying that. I think one of the things that I think is annoyingly dismissive is exactly your point. Be like, oh, I mean, sometimes people just don't vote. What are you going to do about it? It's like, no, these people did vote. They voted
right,
4 years ago.
right.
I mean, that to me. I think that delta, I saw it explained better in your piece than in any other. So I don't want. I've
Thank
already
you.
taken too much of your time. Um, Mike Podhorzer is the former AFL-CIO political director. He now writes a terrific Substack that I would really encourage folks, if they don't subscribe already, to do so. It's called Weekend Reading. And the piece in particular that we're talking about is how Trump won the anesthetized anti-MAGA majority, which that's great stuff. Love that subhead. Check it out. You will be smarter having read the piece. You will be more well informed, and you will be less, I think, prone to buy into the it's all this or it's all that. The all or nothing thinking that I think seizes up. Anyway, Mike, thank you for taking
All
the
right.
time.
Thank you.
Everyone who joined us, thank you. We're going to keep doing these things because you know what? There's the best way to get smarter is to talk to smart people. It's my theory of the case. And in conversation, I think we learn. So, Mike, thank you for your time.
All right.
Appreciate you.
Thank you. It's
All right,
great
man.
to do it.
All right.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.